Now, we're going to be using a cloud Postgres database that's offered through Vercel, but it's managed by Neon, which is a great company and service. And we're using the free tier, so you don't need to pay for anything or enter any credit card information to use this service. Now, we'll also be using Prisma as our ORM, our object relational mapper, to interact with our database. So instead of writing raw SQL queries, Prisma offers easy-to-use methods to create, read, update, and delete, and more in a very easy way. Now, Prisma has models that we can set up in the schema file, and these models pertain to the database tables. So we'll have products and users, sessions, so we'll have a whole bunch of different models in our schema, and this is where we define, and we have some components including the product card display. We can start to implement our database. Now, we're going to be using a cloud Postgres database that's offered through Vercel, but it's managed by Neon, which is a great company and service. And we're using the free tier, so you don't need to pay for anything or enter any credit card information to use this service. Now, we'll also be using Prisma as our ORM, our object relational mapper, to interact with our database. So instead of writing raw SQL queries, Prisma offers easy-to-use methods to create, read, update, and delete, and more in a very easy way. Now, Prisma has models that we can set up in the schema file, and these models pertain to the database tables. So we'll have products and users, sessions, so we'll have a whole bunch of different models in our schema. And this is where we define our fields along with their types and other annotations like default values and primary keys. Now, once we have those models, we can then use them to run a migration, which will actually create the database tables with all those fields. So there's no having to go into something like pgadmin to create our database fields and provision the database. It does it all for us through migrations. And I want to have some sample data to work with, so I'm going to show you how we can set up seeding, which is an easy, reusable way to populate our database with sample data. Now, another library that we're going to be using is called Zod. It's a schema validation library, and we'll be using it to validate our data to make sure that it's in the correct format, and we can integrate this with TypeScript really easily. So once everything is set up and we run our migrations, we'll refactor our code to use the database and Prisma instead of just using the sample data we've been using. And we're going to create the product details page as well as the product images component, which will have a large image and then some clickable thumbnails under it. And then lastly, we're going to actually deploy the application to Vercel. And usually I wait till the end, but I want this course to be more realistic and to show you how to deploy your application and then have continuous deployment so that when we push to GitHub, your application will just automatically be deployed to Vercel. So we'll have our development environment and we'll have our production environment throughout the course. All right, so let's get started setting up our database. All right, guys, so now we're going to set up our database, which ultimately is going to come from Neon, which is a serverless platform that offers cloud Postgres databases. And they have a very generous free tier. So you see here, 10 projects, half a gig storage. This is more than enough for what we're doing. Obviously, if you go into production, you're going to want to look into upscaling to a paid plan. Now, you can set up your database through the Neon interface if you want. However, Vercel now offers Neon databases right through their interface. And since we're using Vercel for production, we might as well use that. So just log into Vercel, go to your dashboard, and I'm just going to use a different project here, or different account. And then if you go to storage, you have these different options, and one of them is Neon Serverless Postgres. So we're going to click Create. It's literally just a couple clicks to set this up. And then choose your region, choose the plan, which we're going to stick with the free plan, but if you wanted to, upscale, you could. These are the same plans we just saw on the Neon website. And then click Continue. We're going to name it, so I'm just going to call it ProStore DB. Click Create, and that's it. We now have a cloud database, a Postgres database. And this gives you a bunch of information. If you click Show Secret, this database URL, we're going to want to put this in our .env, but don't do that just yet because when we initialize Prisma, then it actually adds this for you. Now, Prisma is an ORM, or an object relational mapper, and it allows us to interact with our database with just a ton of different methods, whether create, read, update, and delete, and a bunch of other stuff. And then we can also map our models or map our schema with models, and we can use those models to create migrations so that we can easily create tables and fields and so on. So it's extremely powerful. It's it integrates with TypeScript very well. So that's what we'll be using. So let's set that up. So I'm going to go to my project and open my terminal and just run npm install as a dev dependency, Prisma, and also at Prisma/client. Okay, so once we install that, it should be in your package.json. You should see Prisma and Prisma client. Now, we have to initialize it, and what that does is it creates a schema file. And we do that with npx, Prisma, and then init. Okay, so you can see it gave us this Prisma folder and then the schema.prisma file. And this is where we create all of our models. Now, the database URL in our .env, it should be there now. Okay, so it actually added these comments, which you can get rid of if you want, and then the database URL, which obviously you need to replace that with your own. So just come back to Vercel, and we're going to grab this and copy it and then paste it here within the quotes. And now that's it, where we should be able to easily work with our database. Now, before we move on to creating models, I just want to show you the Prisma extension for VS Code. So I would highly recommend installing this. It gives you syntax highlighting, auto-completion, and you can set it to use the formatter. Now, I believe you do have to add something to your main user JSON file. So if you do Command or Control-Shift-P and just type in JSON, and then choose this, Open User Settings. And if you don't have this in there, then just add it. So we're just saying for Prisma, use the Prisma formatter. And that way, if something in this file is not formatted correctly, if I save, it goes right back to where it should be. All right, so yeah, I think that we'll stop here. And in the next video, we'll start to create our product model, and we'll also look at migrations. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Prisma models, which are extremely important because models, they're used to create your client, so basically the methods that you can use, and it's also used for migrations, which ultimately create the table and all the fields with specific types and constraints and stuff like that. Now, this documentation page shows you how to set up models, and you're going to do that within your schema.prisma file. Okay, so you have a schema with models in it. Sometimes I'll use schema and model interchangeably, but really the whole thing together is your schema, and each one of these is a model. So as you can see, we define the model, and then we have the whatever field we want, like an ID, and then the type. And then there's other annotations you can add, such as @ID, which will make it a primary key. You can add default values. There's certain functions like auto increment, so different things that you can add here. So what we're going to do is jump into schema.prisma, and we're going to create our product model. So let's say model product. And then we want to have our fields. So basically, the fields we're using, if we look at the sample data, it's going to be all these. Now, in addition to that, we do want an ID, and we do want a created @ field. So let's add the ID, and then we put the type, which in this case is going to be a string. Okay, now there are some other annotations I want to add, like @ID and so on, but I'll do that after we get all the fields and types. So ID string, then we're going to have a name, that's also a string. And if I save, it should format it because we have that extension installed. And then slug, which will also be a string. Now, the reason we're seeing this red line is it says each model must have at least one unique criteria. So just to get rid of that, I'm going to add @unique onto the slug because we do want the slug to be unique. And then let's add some other fields like category. So category string, we want images. Now, images is going to be an array of strings, so we just want to add brackets like that. Then we're going to have brand, so brand string, and let's see, description. So description, and then we're going to have stock, which is going to be an int, so that's an integer. And then price is going to be a decimal, and rating is also going to be a decimal because you can have 4.5, things like that. And then let's see, the num reviews. So num reviews is going to be an int. And then we have is featured. So is featured is going to be a Boolean. And then we have the banner, which is going to be a string. And it's also going to be optional. So we can add a question mark that makes it optional. And then let's do created @, and that's going to be date time. So those are all the types. Now there's a couple annotations I want to add. So for instance, for the ID, I want to add @ID. That'll make it a primary key. And then I want it to have a default value that's formatted as a UUID. So we can do that by adding default. And then inside default, we're going to use a DB generated function and then pass in GEN underscore random underscore UUID. And that's going to have parentheses. And then after that, we're going to use the @DB annotation. This just allows us to kind of customize the type a little more, and we're going to do dot, and it's actually one of the options here, the UUID. All right, so that's going to take care of the ID and make it just a random UUID. Let's see, for the slug, we're going to keep it unique, but we're also going to add an index by using map, and we can name that index. So I'm going to call it product underscore slug underscore IDX. Okay, which just makes it a little more convenient. And then for the price, I want to have a default of 0. Now, the price is going to be a decimal. So again, we can use the @DB annotation to customize it further. So we can say dot decimal. and then we can specify how many numbers we want on each side of the decimal, or the max amount of numbers. So I'm going to do 12 on the left side, and then 2. And then let's see, I want to do the same thing for rating, so I'm going to just copy that, and I'm just going to change the 12 to a 3 here. Hey guys, it's me from the future. So I did forget one thing that I wanted to add to, so you can avoid any issues, and that is add a default for the is featured. It's a Boolean, so we want it to be set to false by default. Okay, and then for the num reviews, we'll also add a default of 0. And then finally for the created at, I want to add a default, and let's make it the current date and time, which we can use the now function. And then to customize the timestamp a little further, we can do @db.timestamp, timestamp, and actually it's lowercase. And then I'm just going to add 6, and what that'll do is it'll add the milliseconds onto the end of it with 6 digits, so we can be more precise with the date and time. So that's going to be our model. Let's go ahead and save it. Now, there's a couple things we need to do. One, after you create a model or you change or do anything in here, you want to generate your client, because that's what's going to create the different methods and stuff to work with this model. And before I run the command locally, I'm going to add a script to the package.json, because we need to do that on our server when we deploy. So under scripts, we're going to add a post install script, which just means it's going to run after we push to our server, and we're going to run Prisma and then generate. Okay, so let's just get that in there so I don't forget. And then we want to run it locally, so let's run npx prisma generate. And you might have to stop your server. Oh, my server's not even running. All right, so let's go ahead and run that. I'm just going to make this a little bigger so I can see. Yeah, so we have a check mark with generated Prisma client. Good. Now, the next thing we want to do is add, we want to have a migration and add it to the database. It's going to add a table called product with all these fields. So we do that by saying npx Prisma, and we want to do migrate dev, and then we can give it a name. So we can say -- name, and I'm going to name it init because we're initializing our database. This is the first migration. So let's run that. And this will create the migration file, but it also runs it, so we should have the table in our database. And I'll show you how we can check that with a tool called Prisma Studio. All right, so it says your database is now in sync with your schema. If you look in Prisma now, you'll see a migrations folder and the timestamp underscore and then the name that we gave it, which is init. And all it is a SQL file with the SQL that runs. So it creates the product table, okay, and it's just based off of our model. It creates a unique index called product slug IDX, because we created that index in the file. All right, now to check the actual database, you could use something like pgadmin, but we have a great tool that we can use just by running npx Prisma Studio. And that's going to run on localhost 5555. And basically, we have right here all models, and obviously we only have one, but if we look at it, product. And then we have our fields, ID, name, slug, category, images array, brand, description, stock. We got price, rating, num reviews, is featured, banner, and created at. So now when we have any data, we can simply open up Prisma Studio and we can check it all out, and we can delete stuff and change stuff. So what I want to do in the next video is add some data here. Now obviously we can't do that through our application yet, so we're going to use a seeder. Prisma gives you tools to create a seeder to add sample data to your database.